Simply looking out over its gorgeous vistas and up at its gnarly monster designs was enough to sell a curious dungeon diver like myself on Ravenbound. But as much as that first impression made me want to love this roguelike, turbulence threw this bird far off course soon after taking flight. What starts as a promising action game eventually had me flying against a torrent of obscure and regressive systems, a flurry of frustratingly uncontrollable loot randomness, and a storm of very annoying bugs that quickly grounded any hopes I had for it. As the Raven, a weapon made by the old imprisoned gods of the world of Vault, you'll possess a randomly generated character called a vessel on each new run. Every vessel has a different mix of mostly mediocre traits, weapon specialities, and even racial bonuses, but they'll all inherit your own persistent ability to soar across the sky as a magic bird. You'll wander the vast and boring stretches of this open world's 5 admittedly beautiful regions, dropping in on enemy camps, killing everyone in sight, and collecting items as part of an aggravating card-based loot system until you're strong enough to slay the betrayer god who doomed this world. Combat isn't complex, but it can be fun. Successful hacking and slashing with any of the 5 weapon types comes down to mastering the satisfying dodge and parry systems, both of which give powerful combat buffs when executed precisely. Well-timed dodges can put you in a frenzied state that supercharges your attack speed, while perfect parries can knock enemies down. The rewards for getting good at these techniques are well worth the risks and are essential for taking down late-game enemies and bosses. That said, there is so much about the systems that interface with combat that feels obtuse. Keywords tied to buffs, debuffs, and abilities can sometimes be straightforward, but others are less obvious and occasionally not even defined in the codex. After the 15 plus hours it took me to get my first clear, I still have no idea what a multi-strike is, or what the luck stat does. Enemies, who are at least plentiful and come in all shapes and sizes, have both standard and elite forms. The elites have modifiers denoted by a title, but again, it's not very clear what the difference between them is. Discovering new mechanics and abilities for yourself is a staple of the Souls-like genre, but there's a line between nudging you to test your strength against mysterious opponents to reach an aha moment and being frustratingly opaque that Ravenbound does not walk well. The Warden bosses at the end of every region are tough tests of your item builds and endurance as they relentlessly attack, with long combos leaving very small windows for counterattack. They are sort of samey, but each one is a frantic back and forth fight. These challenges can be fun when they aren't suffering from some of Ravenbound's most pernicious bugs, like one that doesn't track boss health accurately. This doesn't make the bosses unkillable, but it does make having any idea of your progress against them impossible. That's also just one of many bugs plaguing Ravenbound. Audio tracks overlap with each other, or just cut out entirely. NPCs and shopkeepers occasionally vanish. I've had about a half a dozen crashes, which are annoying even if the auto-saving is diligent enough that I never lost progress because of it. None of these are game-breaking issues, but the sum of them does drag down the moments where I might otherwise be having fun. Ravenbound uses collectible card game motifs to house its otherwise familiar systems in ways that are hit and miss. Everything you could potentially find or earn during a given run is a card in your deck, like the suit of armor that makes enemies bleed when you parry them. Every time you would gain one of these things, you draw your choice of one of 3 cards from the larger deck to see what it'll be, and then it sits in your hand until you spend a resource called mana to activate or equip it. I liked that this meant I could hold on to something that might be useful in the future, making finding new loot a little less all or nothing than some other roguelikes. There are at least a decent handful of ways to earn item draws mid-run. Straight up buying them from vendors is the safest way, but it costs gold, which you'll need to earn by clearing camps full of monsters. Alternatively, the elite monsters in camps drop fragments, collecting 3 of which allows you to draw cards to add to your hand. These monsters are also often guarding treasure chests, which also contain some loot. That meant that I always felt like I had opportunities to take another spin of the wheel. I just wish I could better influence what was on it. I often chose not to spin that wheel at all thanks to the hatred mechanic. Whenever you open a chest covered in a red aura, a card on your next draw is replaced by one that automatically buffs every elite and boss monster in the region for the rest of your run. Every time you combine fragments, a bar in the bottom right corner fills up a little more. When one of those sections is filled up entirely, it will similarly turn one of your next card draws into a boss buff until you kill the boss of that particular region you're in. These enemy buffs can really add up and make every draw more and more risky, sometimes disproportionately so, since there's no way to guarantee that the next card you draw is useful after fighting increasingly harder enemies for it. There is an early reprieve for this built into the main quest. When you first enter each of the 5 regions, a rift is marked on your map. Traveling across these beautiful forests, arid deserts, or dank marshes to get to them, these rifts present you with an opportunity to cleanse a handful of nearby chests of their hatred while scoring a good amount of mana in the process. Taking down these rifts' guardians and then plundering the newly cleaned treasure for free helps you get off to the races. But I found that if I didn't get a solid weapon, piece of armor, or key relic for a strong build out of this initial haul, then I was likely better off just re-rolling a new character than attempting to wing it for the next hour. If you follow the main quest markers, you'll spend very little time in each region outside of clearing rifts and fighting world bosses. Side quests for each section, but that involves traveling to a lifeless city, talking to wooden NPCs, and taking on a task that is some version of killing a target with the added frills of a completely ignorable motivation from a throwaway character. As an open world game, you are free to explore on your own, but there isn't a huge reason to do so very thoroughly. As enticing as the well-designed ruins of old forts or mysterious mining caves are, there's often no prize in them worth the trouble that you couldn't also find just dropping in on any random camp on the surface. This is a hugely disappointing use of Ravenbound's beautiful, Scandinavian folklore-inspired environments. There is no part of Ravenbound that is absolutely bad. In fact, most of it is a good foundation for a fun roguelike, from its solid combat to its interesting setting and enemies. But so much of Ravenbound feels like it's either missing a key piece that would elevate it, or is just poorly executed, with frustratingly unpredictable loot or obnoxiously obtuse systems. On top of that, it's infested with bugs that take those issues from disappointing to outright annoying. There's certainly some fun to be had in Ravenbound, but it's hard to recommend leaving the nests to find it. For more action, check out our reviews of Have a Nice Death or Resident Evil 4. And for everything else, stick with IGN.